Before I introduce our guest presenter, Catherine Vincie, this evening, she's going to start us with a prayer that she composed.
What I want to begin with is a collect opening prayer that I wrote for my Eucharistic prayer on the new Cosmology, which I'm trying to get circulated even unto Rome, if it would possibly happen. So I just thought it would be a nice prayer to open with. So let us pray. Blessed are you, holy God of all that was, is, and ever shall be. In your goodness and infinite generosity, you poured yourself out in creation from the first flaring forth of matter and energy to this very day. Open our eyes in awe at the wonder of your universe. Turn our hearts to gratitude for your ongoing work of creation, and awaken our hope for the dream of a new creation when you shall be all in all. And we ask this in the name of Jesus the Christ and of your life-giving Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Catherine. That's a beautiful text. If I had a tie into Rome, I would send it in for you. So, all right. So let me introduce Catherine Vincie. She is a sister of the Sacred Heart of Mary. And in fact, right now she's on the leadership team for her community. So she's zooming in from Tarrytown, New York. She is Professor Emerita from the Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis. Catherine has her PhD from Catholic University here in DC and a master's in sacred music from Yale Divinity School. She is also past president from 2011 of the North American Academy of Liturgy. And most recently, I got to know her because we are in the same seminar for the Academy, the Christian Initiation Seminar. So I've had the opportunity to hear Catherine present papers and be in conversation with her. She's the author of many books and many, many articles in the field of liturgy, including RCIA, most recently interest in liturgy and the new cosmology, and many, many other topics that she's written on. So I'm really delighted to welcome Catherine this evening to our Women Who Stayed series.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I tuned in last week when Sandra Snyder's was here. It was just such fun. So It's just delightful to be in conversation with all of you. And I hope that the evening is interesting to all of you.
Thank you. So once again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then we'll get to the Q&A in a little bit. So Catherine, my first question to you is what drew you into the field of liturgy as your focus in theology?
Well, I have a divided life. One half of my life is music, and the other half of my life is theology. And I have an undergraduate degree in piano performance. And then when I entered the community, one of the sisters, who is a very gifted organist, decided I would be the next organist in the community. It was one of those things that happen in religious life. Somebody points a finger and says, "You're going to do this."
Yes.
So she said, "And I'm going to teach you." So I went down to DC. She was at Marymount Arlington. And I studied organ with her, started my organ studies with her and continued. But what I ended up doing was playing liturgies, of course, once I got proficient at the instrument. And of all the things you can do in theology, I said, I've got to make a connection here and choose something that I'm interested in and at all the time. So it was the music that brought me into the liturgical studies area. And it's been a wonderful combination in my life because I've never been able to choose one over the other. And every time I try to go back to my music, well, I do liturgical studies because that was so interesting. And then I'd have to earn a living. So I had to get a church job as an organist. But what it has done over the years is it has kept me tied as an academic to the pastoral scene. And that for me is very important because I don't want to be an isolated academic. I want to be someone who is working within the church community, quite literally. And having the music and being an organist, pianist, has allowed me to do that. So that's how I ended up in liturgical studies. It was just, I wasn't that great in languages, so biblical theology was out of the question. And the liturgy just fascinated me.
Right. Thank you. No, I applaud your wanting to keep the academic and the pastoral very much intertwined. So important. What was sort of the state of liturgy when you entered that field yourself? I mean, where were we in terms of the Second Vatican Council and the implementation of the Council's vision?
Well, I went to Yale Divinity School through the Institute of Sacred Music in 1980. So we're well after the council. And we are also in a time where there was, ISIL was very active in the English-speaking world to do the kinds of translations and invention of text, the creation of text that were suitable to an English-speaking audience. There was a lot of excitement at that time for the possibility of women's ordination. Everybody thought we would have it by 1977, if you recall, if you were around at that time. It didn't happen, needless to say. But the liturgy, it was an exciting place to be. I think immediately after the council, and magazine like Worship Magazine was a magazine that was subscribed to by many people, many priests, many sisters, many laity, interested in our tradition because it had become a question, what did we used to do? Did we always do it the way we did coming out of the Council of Trent, or did we do something different prior to that? So the very recognition of the historicity of the liturgy, that no, we haven't always done things the same, and therefore we might do things differently again. That whole conversion of being able to think that there might be a different way of doing things was definitely on the horizon at that point in time.
Right. No, there certainly would have been an exciting time to be in liturgy. Did you discover and have you discovered along the way barriers for you as a woman working in liturgy?
Let me tell you one or two stories. When I got out of graduate school, I knew I didn't belong in a Roman Catholic seminary, but it was one of the only 4 jobs that was open in the country that year that I was looking for work. And I ended up working at Seton Hall, the Immaculate Conception Seminary at Seton Hall. Now, they weren't particularly very open to women, and they certainly weren't open to women who had any kind of a feminist leaning. I was also there when the Neo-Catechumenate was sending men to Seton Hall for ordination studies. And if you know anything about the Neo-Catechumenate, it's extremely conservative movement. But anyway, they were some of the ordination students. And they had a separate formation house from the formation house for the rest of the seminarians from the United States. I think they came from like 8 different dioceses. So anyway, the Neocats decided that they did not want to take Eucharist from a woman. So they went to the dean and said, we demand that we have a man teach Eucharist, because obviously a woman cannot teach Eucharist properly. So the dean, the acting dean at the time, went along with them, called Fordham and said, do you have any graduate students who would be able to teach this course? So they recommended this one gentleman. And I didn't know any of this was going on. So then one day I get a call from this graduate student who tells me that he's been asked by Immaculate Conception Seminary to teach Eucharist. I said, oh, isn't that interesting? I said, well, how much liturgy do you know? He said, well, I really don't know very much. I've only ever taken one liturgy course, and it was Eucharist. So, by the way, could you lend me your syllabus so I could teach the course, because I don't know very much about it? So I said, I think we have to hold this conversation and get back to the dean and see what we're going to do next. Because obviously competence in the field made no difference whatsoever. It was just whether a man could teach it, because obviously a woman couldn't teach it. So, I mean, that was one of my classic stories. And there were others like that. So we've all experienced it in various ways. But I've experienced it when I only taught there for 2 years and then I resigned because feminist women were so unwelcome in the environment. And I just said, I cannot live here anymore under those circumstances. So that was the end of my time in a diocesan seminary.
Right. What is your sense of that today? I know you're not teaching in seminary today, but do you have a feel for what's happening in seminaries across the country now?
Well, I'm only going to talk about the experience at Aquinas, because I'm not familiar with what's going on across the country at the moment. There was, when I went to this Aquinas Institute in 1995, my first semester, I was asked to teach a course in feminist liturgy. And that was very far from being having my Eucharist students taken away from me, because I was leaning towards feminism to some degree at that point in time. And there was great excitement. I had a wonderful experience with the Dominican brothers, who were a very small percentage of a much larger population of lay students. And over the years, though, there was an increasing shift to more conservative ordination candidates that made teaching there less satisfying and more problematic than I had previously experienced in my early years there. So this shift to conservatism, I know it didn't just happen at Aquinas, it happened elsewhere as well. But it would come in waves. So one year you'd get a great class, and then the next year they were very, very threatened by women. And then you'd have the next class and they were fine. And, it was kind of bumpy towards the end of my time there. But, I don't think it was unique to Aquinas. I do think it was a general trend throughout the country.
So Catherine, who have been your mentors along the way, as especially as you were doing your studies and entering the field?
Well, certainly the most important person in my mentor in my academic life was Margaret Farley from Yale Divinity School. I studied ethics with her. Some of you may also have done the same. And she directed my thesis. I did my master's thesis on feminist theology and liturgy. And she directed my thesis for that. But she did something else for me. she was one of the first people to go to Yale, to be on the faculty at Yale. Well, she was one of the first women to go to Yale Divinity School in the first place, and then certainly to become a member of the faculty. But she helped me to imagine what it would be like to be a woman theologian in the church. And that had never occurred to me before. And as I proceed with my studies and people were encouraging me to do the doctoral studies and, go into academics, her leadership and my friendship with her certainly was very, very important and remains so today. The other people who are very important to me, certainly in the field of liturgical studies, was Mary Collins. Again, the same age cohort as Margaret, just one generation above me. And I remember trying to find my way in the liturgical field and trying to figure out what emphasis. I mean, 2,000 years of history, there's a lot you can do. You have to make some choices, and what kind of an approach do you want to take? And I sat down and read 20 years of worship one week. And
that's really good, Catherine.
Just to get the lay of the land, to see, what were people doing? And there was an article that she wrote that was in Worship on critical liturgical studies. And that, when I read it, I said, that's it. That's what I want to do. That's the vision of academic study that I want to have, which was an approach to studying the liturgy, but from the perspective of contemporary issues. So whether that was justice issues or from the perspective of the different liberation theologies, feminist theology being one of them, the human rights perspective, clericalism, colonialism, all those issues as a lens through which one could view the history of the liturgy or contemporary practice. I do not consider myself a historian of the liturgy. I know it, but it's not my specialty. I am much more attentive to the contemporary celebrations of the Roman Catholic Church at this point in time, and asking critical questions about what we do in practice, why we do it, and could we do it differently. So it was interesting when I got to see you, I guess, no, it was before I went to see you. There was an issue of Concilium that Mary Collins and David Power edited together called Can We Always Celebrate the Eucharist? This was 1982. This is a shocking question in 1982. And there was an article in it by Elizabeth Schisler Fiorenza, and I read it, and I remember the quote to this day. She said, can we always celebrate the Eucharist when the Eucharist itself is the embodiment of sin? But how can we be Christians without celebrating the Eucharist? That was a mind-blowing question to consider at that point in time in 1982, to do a feminist critique about the liturgy that would name it as a sinful experience, meaning gender biased to a significant degree, was mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. And that touched me very much and moved me in the direction of critical liturgical studies. And then, of course, David Power was also very important in my formation as a liturgical theologian. So those three people, Mary Collins, David Power, and Margaret Farley are my three heroes.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really wonderful. And as you were talking, Catherine, I started like tagging all these articles of yours that I've read and referred to and cite to in my mind, because you have done so much cutting edge kind of work looking at those intersections between contemporary issues. I think I told you I have my students read your chapter on naming toward God. You know, the
yeah.
language, the metaphors, the images that we use when speaking about God to get this young generation aware of our language around God.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, because I know some of your more recent work. What are some of the areas that you're pushing on currently? What has been some of your more recent scholarship?
Well, right. At this moment, I've been in and out of writing in the last 5 years because of my other responsibilities now in leadership. But I was working on an article on, well, let me say this. Feminist theology has, and feminist scholars have looked at Christology, they've looked at soteriology, they looked at ecclesiology, but they haven't addressed every single issue within all those fields. It just hasn't been possible yet to do that. Well, one of the questions that became important to me is that when I was teaching courses in baptism, I was kind of perplexed to say, what do we do with original sin? And I had to teach original sin, and I hated teaching original sin. And so that was kind of in the back of my head. And then a couple of years ago, I decided to say, well, once I had gotten into the studies on the new cosmology, I said, what would a theology of baptism look like if you critiqued original sin from the new science? So there were a number of people who were beginning to write some articles or parts of chapters on a new theology of original sin, like Dennis Edwards and a few other people, not too many, but there were a couple. And I, being a liturgical theologian, I wanted to follow the link of, well, it's one thing to critique original sin from the new science, but what does that mean for baptism? Because in our liturgical books, we are still baptized, and particularly in the children's rite, it says quite deliberately that we baptize for the forgiveness of original sin and all subsequent sins after that. And the general introduction to both the adult rite and the infant rite has a reference to that. So that I started that about 3 years ago, and I passed it along to Beth Johnson and asked her to critique it, and she did. And it didn't come out as wonderfully as I had hoped. So I put it in the drawer for a while. I said, it's not the time for it. It's not, I worked really hard on it, but it still wasn't there yet. So we had the great lockdown in March and April and May. And we were working from home on the leadership team, but I also had extra time. So I said, what the heck, let me take this article out again and see if I can bring it into shape and make something of it and repair some of the inadequacies that I had in the last version. So I did that, and I passed it on to Jack Haught and a couple of other people, Ed Foley and some other friends of mine. And they said, this is good stuff now. You can go with it. So anyway, that's the last thing I've written. It's coming out in Worship Magazine in January. So that's the next piece that I'm working on. Don't ask me what's after that yet.
Okay, I know I want to ask you after that. And your most recent book is Worship in the New Cosmology, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Thank you. How many of you knew that original sin was such a contemporary topic, right? we're rethinking it.
You have, we talk about, death came into the world by, with sin, But then you say, wait a minute, when you look at the new science and evolution, how do you put those two thought worlds together? And they don't fit. And, what about the human capacity for sin or tendency to sin? Did we invent sin? And then you read the studies on zoology on the higher primates, and they cheat, they steal, they murder, they do all these things. And we don't attribute to them the kind of higher intellectual and ethical formation that we claim for ourselves. But nonetheless, things that are intrinsic to our existence began before us. So how do we put that together? How do we make those lines of connection between the new things we're learning with science and traditional theology of on original sin that has its roots right from the beginning of the Christian tradition?
Right, right. Catherine, what for yourself what has kept you in liturgy and in the church more broadly?
Mm. Well, within liturgy, that's easy. There's a lot of work that still remains to be done. When I was the president of North American Academy of Liturgy and I gave the vice presidential address the year before, I was looking around and I was saying the systematic theologians and the biblical theologians have done a lot with the new cosmology. And I looked at the liturgical theologians and we had done nothing, virtually nothing at that point. And I challenged the Academy, which was an ecumenical and Jewish Christian group, to say, you're the people that are on the boards of worship committees, of denominational worship committees. You're responsible for the development and the new editions of denominational hymn books and etc. And I said, we're not coming up to the plate and doing enough. We need to do something. All of us need to do something across the denominations within the Jewish community. And I said, it's time for us to get to the work of it. So I worked that talk into the new, the book on worship and the new cosmology. But that's a field that is huge. It's huge. And there's so much work that needs to be done yet. It's interesting, of course, that hymn writers have moved forward faster than liturgical scholars on this. But it's also not surprising, since the most, shall we say, the most, what's the word I'm looking for? The place in the liturgy that is most flexible to receive new work is music and liturgical hymns and preaching. So there's been a number of composers and lyricists who in the last particularly 10 years have really focused on the possibility of bringing text to the people that do take the new science seriously. I would not say the same thing is true within the homiletic practice, in my experience, at least of it. We still have enormous ways to go regarding that.
Yeah.
Now, staying in the church, that's that's another question. I have a very high theology of church. Part of it comes from my study of Karl Rahner, and is from him what I have come to value is that for whatever reason, God has chosen to work through the material universe, through human persons, through human institutions. Now, if I was running the show, I don't think I would have done that. But for some reason, God decided that's okay. And in spite of the limitations of the human experience, in spite of the limitations of the institutions that humans create. I still believe that the mystery of God is revealed to some extent in human institutions, including the church. And I believe that the church is that when we talk about the church as mystery, that's what we're talking about. The fact that God is revealed to some extent through this very fragile institution we call church. It's always been that way. It's always going to be that way. And I don't know where else to go where it's any better.
Yeah.
So Ronner has saved me because of his high Christology, his high ecclesiology, his high theology of the church. That for me has really been an important touchstone.
Yeah.
To say I have not suffered in the church, and all of us probably can say that, is not true. I've lost jobs because of gender bias. I was served on ISIL for 3 years. I was fired from ISIL when the new the turnover happened in the year 2000 when ISIL was reconstructed according to Rome's dictates. I am not naive about the pain that people go through in the church in any way. But I still don't know where else to go. Where would it be better?
Right. Oh, thank you, Catherine. That really resonates with me, and I probably many others participating here. I think we'll turn to some questions, and then if there's
Sure.
time, I still have a couple of questions too. So Liz?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Catherine. This is fascinating. And I have a question for you, a couple, but so do other people. The first thing is Margaret Farley was also my advisor in my studies at Yale, feminist ethics and theology. And I was at her 70th or 75th birthday. I think she's 86 now, I'm not sure. And there were a number of Catholic women gathered, and one of them said to her, why do you stay Catholic? Why do you remain in the church? And I will never forget her answer. She said, because it still brings me life. And I've held on to that through the years. So that's not a question. I was going to ask you why you stay, but you've answered it eloquently. But the question, so we are the women who stay. So that's the study that we have undertaken, started with the women at the cross who stayed with Jesus. Of course, we've studied now lots of women, biblical and some eminent theologians and scholars like yourself who have stayed. And what we've been trying to do is to bring your scholarship, the feminist scholarship that's out there, into our own spirituality, into our own way of thinking about church. And what I'd like to ask now, here comes my question. In terms of your scholarship, what can we be doing in our parish, in our liturgy that we can do? You mentioned preaching and song. Is there anything you could see as a way we could take some of that and have a feminist liturgy at our church? What would that look like?
Simple question she asked, isn't it? Number one, I think one way of doing that is by, and this has been going on for quite a few years now, is that women have gathered in groups just of women and have practiced ritualizing. I know when I was doing my project at Yale, I did a study. I sent out a questionnaire across the country to all the graduate schools of theology and asked for feminist liturgies to be sent to me if they were written down, if they came in written form. And overwhelmingly, it was the litany of naming. Do you remember that from back in the 80s when we went through the biblical women's names and all sorts of names? Now, I was convinced by the time I finished my study that there was an text, an original text that had simply been emailed or mailed at that point in time all over the country, and everybody was using the same litany of naming. But that was the beginning stage, but it was a necessary stage. And I think we're, as women, we were learning, what does it mean to express an understanding of God, an understanding of human relations, an understanding of ourselves, when we turn to those things with a specific framework of women's experience. What is it we're going to say? Is it any different than what we have been saying? And of course it was. And do we want to do something different than what has always been done? And we found, we started with this litany of naming, something different. And we've moved in many different fields, different areas in terms of the development of sensitivity within feminist theology, that women, white women's theology does not speak to every racial group and everyone's experience. So recognizing there's not uniformity about women's experience. So that was very important. So we moved into the diversity, attention to diversity and care that we not presume everybody has the same experience. So, I mean, I just on that one area, I do think that women should and take the opportunity to be by themselves, at least for some time, and practice ritualizing. Now, the question is, how do you get into a parish situation? How do you get into something that, well, I think what I'd also say is that don't expect that the first place you're going to start is Eucharist in a parish. There are multiple, we are a multi-ritual church, and there are many places that one can bring a feminist perspective or a woman's perspective to bear on how things are done and what things are done. So when I think of, you know, penance services for Lent, for example, you know, even formulating them, you know, looking at the Valerie Savings article of 1974, even, where she talks about women's sin is different than men's sin. So if you were preaching that night, are you sensitive to that? Can you bring, you know, she talks about, you know, men's sin is pride and women's sin is lack of achievement or lack of sense of accomplishment or sense of self. You know, you can't give yourself away until you have a self. And she was saying that in fact, women need to develop their sense of self, and that's what they struggle with. So there are lots of opportunities within parish work of just prayer services that don't have a structure at all. If you want to have a gathering in Advent, there are no Advent prayer services, official liturgical services about Advent, except for singing O Come, Emmanuel. You know, but that's an opportunity, again, to get into the parish circulation, different approaches, different language of God, different understandings of sin, of redemption, all the background work that people have been doing. I think the last thing that's going to get integrated is the Eucharist, because it's such an important ritual for us, carries so much baggage, psychological baggage, theological baggage, fears, concerns. I mean, when I talked about that Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza article of saying, how can we celebrate Eucharist if it's the epitome of sin? I mean, that's a shocking question.
No,
And
that
I would,
oh, I was just going to say, I don't want to interrupt you, but there's a precise question on this, and you're about to answer it probably. But yes, that is a radical thing. And the question that came in privately is, how do we just in our spiritualize, or maybe how do you reconcile that Eucharist sin with a desire for Eucharist, which most of us haven't partaken of in the last months anyway, but how do you reconcile those two things in practice? So at Holy Trinity, you might know this, there was a period in our history where parishioners would stand up and they would wear blue stoles, and I believe they wouldn't go to communion, and it was a protest about women being excluded from leadership, from priesthood and whatnot. Is
Right.
that the kind of thing that might be required in order to change our approach to Eucharist? What would you suggest? Because that's a hard one.
Yes, it is a very difficult one. Well, I'll go back to the earlier question that you asked of how do I reconcile myself. First of all, I do shopping. I do church shopping like you have done, and finding a parish that is life-giving and is less problematic than most. It doesn't answer all the desires that we have. Even the best parish doesn't answer all the desires that we have. But there are some more difficult to participate in than others. So you have to make good choices, judicious choices. One of the things that keeps me even celebrating in the tradition, within the tradition, is that I try to remember that all liturgy is the fruit of someone's religious experience. So the fact that Cyprian had a religious experience, his own spirituality that was truthful and authentic, got reflected in some of the work that he was doing. You know, for example, that the practice of allowing the lapsed in the 3rd century, when there was the Decian persecution, and some people were faithful and some people were not faithful at the persecution and were called the lapsi. And they were barred from communion, from the reception of communion. They weren't barred from going to Eucharist, but they were barred from the reception of the communion because that was seen as the sign of communion of the community. They were out of communion with the community. And the persecution ceased, but then there was rumor that another persecution was coming down the pike. And the question was, could these people receive communion? And Cyprian said, how can we expect them to be faithful this next time round if we're not feeding them at the very table that could give them the kind of spiritual strength and courage to face a persecution? So there was the rigorous position that said, no, 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 no. And he changed that practice and said, yes, there's a possibility of forgiveness and reinstatement. So, I mean, there's an example where someone's pastoral sense really changed him and asked him to change the laws, the liturgical laws at the time. So liturgy certainly is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it is the fruit of people's authentic religious experience. It might be male dominated. It might be dominated by Rome the Roman culture. It might be dominated by Germanic practices, but it is the religious experience of someone. So for me to, think that I'm the first generation in the history of Christianity who has authentic religious experience and needs to bring it to ritual is arrogant beyond beyond. So I can find some ease with both the richness of what we celebrate and the lack, the fact that we're missing the mark, and there's a lot of things that are wrong.
No, that's a great way to think of it as, being born from experience. It's more life-giving to think in terms of that. We have some other questions in the chat, and I'm going, and some of them circle back to Eucharist, but I'm just going to go in the order they came in. And Lee Jones, if you're still here, if you want to ask your question about the Good Shepherd.
Catherine, I was really excited to know that you were coming, and I searched around and listened to your.
Could you speak a little louder into the mic, a little closer into the mic, please?
And Lee, I think you froze. We might have to come. We might.
Let's come back. Let's come back to Lee.
I'm going to come back because I think your internet will come back, Lee. I hope you can hear me. Arlene,
Okay.
you want to jump in with your question? If you're still there, Arlene. Well, I don't know if she is, but Arlene just wanted to know more about the liturgy of the naming.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Sorry.
That's it. You got it.
Yeah. It was a prayer service where there was a lot of biblical retrieval going on at the time of women in the Bible who had been overlooked and had not been noticed. So retrieving the memory of women was a very important issue in the early 1980s. So at that point in time, there was this effort to remember. So for example, if you can get your hands on Mary Collins's book called Active Participation, she has a litany of naming that takes the genealogy of Matthew and does 4 lines of the memory of the men, and then goes 4 lines with the memory of the women of the Bible. 4 lines of men, 4 lines of women, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are places where she says, like the wife of Jehoiakim is not known. We don't know her name. She'll do that. She'll include the absence of women in the very naming of the ones we do remember and the ones we don't remember. And I've used that as an example many times in my classes for the chance to retrieve the memory of women in a way and use it, the genealogy, if you're having an Advent prayer service. Put that genealogy, that inclusive genealogy, into the service as a way of doing something proactive to bring the memory of women to bear. So I hope that answers your question.
Mary, we'll look up that book. Mary Collins's book.
Active Participation.
Participation. Well, that's a great resource. Circling back to this Eucharist as the epitome of sin. I don't know, Carolyn, if you're there, if you want to ask your question. Carolyn Stoof.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying to unmute. Hi.
Okay.
I've never heard that phrase before, Eucharist as epitome of sin. Could you explain what that means? It seems like contradictory terms to me.
That's right. And that's why it's so shocking.
Yes. So what do you mean?
Well, the fact that in the celebration of Eucharist, women's participation is extremely limited in terms of ministers, in terms of homilists, in terms of the biblical stories that are told, in terms of the saints that were celebrated in the Old Missal. 80% of saints are male, and only 20% are women. And of the 80%, 90% of the men are priests or bishops, clerics. So the presence of the laity in general is missing. So the very celebration embodies the gender limitations of our culture. And to be invisible, to be left out, is sinful. So
Okay.
not to reflect women's experience in our most sacred, our most esteemed ritual is very bad. You know, it's very bad. And Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza puts the word sin on it to just hammer home the importance. It's not good that we are marginalized in Eucharistic celebrations.
Yeah, growing up, I remember the whole communion rail and women weren't allowed in the sacristy. Women
That's
weren't
right.
allowed in that area. The women in the church washed, ironed, and starched altar cloths.
That's right.
I was not allowed to be an altar server. I have 4 brothers. They could do it. I was
That's right.
not. So when I grew up, I became a Eucharistic minister because I really wanted to be around the altar. I wanted to be part of it.
Right.
So I love serving Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Lee, are you back and connected? Lee Jones had that question about the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. Let's see if we can hear you now.
So I am back. I had to back out.
Oh.
So anyway, the question I had was, in your work of bringing together people like Brian Swimmy and Father Thomas Berry and all your cosmology connections, have you ever come across the work of Maria Montessori and her 5 great lessons, which is about the cosmology, and also her friend and biblical scholar Sophia Cavalletti?
That's right.
Who created the Catechesis of the
Good Shepherd. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never participated in it myself, but I have taught. When I was at Aquinas, we had a degree program in persons seeking to be certified as leaders of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. So I know from their experience, it's secondhand experience. I'd never run a atrium before, but I do appreciate so much that they take the spiritual life of the child seriously. And not only that, but their approach is not to begin with the peripheries of the teaching of the church, but to begin with absolutely the most central ideas, because they can get it at the level that they are, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, whatever. And it's the Montessori approach, which is hands-on learning through richer, great appreciation of the work of symbols, etc. So I think it's a marvelous form of catechesis. From my knowledge of it, I just think it is outstanding and needs to be spread.
It is amazing to me how much of the things that you're talking about are the catechesis is very slanted towards the direction of the progress we would like to see made in in the liturgy.
Yeah.
And I've never run an atrium, but I decided at age 70 to go take the training for the, I've finished
Oh,
2
good
of
for
the
you.
3 levels, and to do it as a personal retreat. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what it has been. So thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Well, thank you for doing that. That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Mhm.
Thanks, Lee. Anne, do you have a question? Another question?
Yeah, so yes, I do.
Mhm.
So before everyone joined, I was asking Catherine about what she sees as both the temporary and the long-lasting impact of this pandemic on liturgy.
Oh.
I know I have my own concerns that are fermenting and so on, but I'm interested in where are we going to be on the other side of this with liturgy?
Let me get my crystal ball. I have it over.
Yeah,
on-
I know.
What I keep thinking of now, you have to understand, I did my dissertation on the liturgical assembly. Excuse me. And I know, and we know from church history, is that the church has sometimes celebrated Eucharist 3 times a week. Sometimes it's celebrated twice a week. Sometimes it's celebrated 5 times a week. Sometimes it's celebrated 7 times a week, but it has never not gathered on Sunday to celebrate Eucharist in 2,000 years. Now, we've had a few epidemics along the way in those 2,000 years, which has interrupted the very possibility of gathering as our present epidemic is causing us to pause. But we've been able to, after that crisis was over, we've been able to retrieve the value of gathering together to celebrate something in common. And there are a couple of things I want to say. Number one, I think that after our crisis is over, the human need to gather together. I wish I could hug somebody. You know, the distance that we're supposed to keep between persons is very difficult. We're human beings meant to touch. We're human beings meant to gather. I don't think that's going to go away just because of the pandemic. So I think after the pandemic, those human propensities to gather together to celebrate what's important to us is going to help us get back to some kind of gathering. Now, what's become clear is that if you watch on the Zoom presentations of Eucharist, celebrations of Eucharist, it's quite clear that the assembly has disappeared and we're back to doing Eucharist as before the council, where the Roman Missal does not, the old Roman Missal that was operative from Trent to Vatican II, does not have a single word about the assembly. There's not one word of the assembly in the old Missal, not a word. And we've been trying for 50 some odd years at this point in time to retrieve the intrinsic nature of the Eucharist that is participatory of all members. So when we have these televised masses, it becomes clear that we have not made all that much progress in embodying a participatory liturgy, because we can take away the assembly and have the presider, and then of course we have maybe a woman cantor, and that's all you see of women in the many of the masses that I've seen, and you know, we're back where we started from.
Yeah.
So that has to tell us something, that our catechesis and our liturgical reform has not been as successful as we had imagined or hoped for. So I think that we have to rethink that. The possibility of also participating at a distance through Zoom has brought us to some understanding that if you can't be there in person, this is not so bad. It has allowed a lot of homebound people, all of us who are homebound, to have some access to our faith community and the rituals of the faith community. So I don't know, whether that answers your question. We have to rethink some things. We have to have patience that we are going to assemble again after this is over, but that we need a lot more thought and practice in making sure that the assembly is absolutely central to the celebration.
Yeah, amen to that. Because I share that same concern.
Mhm.
I share concern about the return of the cup too.
Yes,
And,
right.
and just hoping and praying that what was restored to us after the Second Vatican Council, that we don't have to, find a way. And we didn't do a really good job at bringing people around to receiving the cup, and we were lacking in our catechesis there already. So
That's right.
maybe we could see it as an opportunity to,
Mhm.
ramp up our catechesis around the cup.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one other question. When you talked about, the opportunity for, practicing ritualizing, and what women might do in that way. Again, I'm thinking about the time that we're living in, not only the pandemic, but a country that's been torn apart in so many ways. And I'm wondering what, if we think creatively, what role might women have in ritualizing these experiences that we're having right now that are very painful and difficult and confusing?
Mm-hmm.
And what it is we might do.
Well, one of the things that we have retrieved in the last, I'd say 20 years or so, is the understanding that the Christian community has been very bad in lamenting the tragedies and the difficulties and the heartache of the community. The Jewish community is much better equipped to have come to a way of lamenting the horrific things that have happened to their community over the centuries. I think we need to find new forms of lament. If you look at the Psalms, we have Psalms of lament. And the very theology of the Psalms of lament is that one can complain to God about whatever it is that is breaking one's heart. And God can handle it. You can put on your boxing gloves and tussle with God about these very important life experiences you have to live through. But at the end of that complaint, you have let me down, I'm alone, you have let me be overcome by the forces of evil and this and this. And the last two lines of the psalm is always going to be, but I praise you still because I know you will not abandon me to the underworld, or some such phraseology.
Mm-hmm.
So they're faith statements that allow people to put together the tragedy of their lives with praise of God. So I think there's room for that. And certainly in the difficulty we've had in burying people and the tragedy of not being able to have funerals gather for funerals and then only have 6 people at the cemetery or whatever. There is so much to be lamented in this COVID experience. And we have to find ways to, to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Because I see that as a place where women can really step up and lead those kinds of
Mhm.
ritual activities.
Yeah.
And I've already signed you up for an Advent prayer service.
Oh, thank you. I'll do that, Ashley.
Veronica, did you have a question?
Yes, it was only yesterday that I caught online. I was looking for something and I came across the group that's been praying with women religious, but I think the group is called Solidarity with Sisters Communal Prayer for Sunday. They have been meeting, I think, for the whole year. And every week they have a liturgy that is all the things that we're talking about. And they have examples. They put up the page every week, so you can go back and look at that. The prayers, the music, the scripture. They have moments of silence, 5 minutes of silence after the scripture. They ask people to reflect from their own experience within this liturgy. And this whole community has built, and it is growing weekly. And it is the very kind of thing that we have been talking about, or that you've been talking about today. And I think it's one of the most hopeful things I've discovered of this whole range of crazy online masses. And
Yeah, well, thank you for that.
They're the kinds of groups, I think, that if we can get a parish that's open to that, to work with that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. If you could send around that.
I'll send it to Anne. And,
Yeah,
that would be great.
absolutely.
I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Veronica. So Veronica also is a liturgical theologian in Australia. So welcome. We hope to see you again.
Thank you. And thank you very much for allowing us from the other side of the world to be with you in this very healthy and wonderful open conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for
So I
coming.
think we're at the end of our time here already. The time always goes so fast when we do these. Catherine, I can't thank you enough. It's just been so wonderful to have you and to share your insights and so much depth to your insights into liturgy. And, professionally, I appreciate your work so much.
Thank you.
And, just really always, when I see an article by Catherine Vincie, it's got my attention, always. And I enjoyed your books, Liturgy and the New Cosmology and Celebrating the Divine Mysteries. So thank you for joining us this evening.
And thank you so much for inviting me and to be an opportunity to be with all of you. So I very much appreciate it as well.
I wish we could hear you play the organ. Next time.
Yes,
Next time.
next time.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you at
Okay,
the
thank you.
our next series.